The sunlight came through the pines in shafts so sharp and golden they might have been cast from molten brass, each beam cutting the forest floor into geometric patterns of brightness and shadow that shifted and danced as the wind stirred the high branches. Somewhere behind the wall of trees, dogs gave voice, not the friendly baying of hounds trailing a fox for sport, but something hungrier and more desperate, the sound of animals that had tasted blood and wanted more. The howling rose and fell in waves that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a man's racing heart, a rhythm that grew faster and more frantic with each passing second. Governor Walter Emmett Harlan fell hard onto the carpet of pine needles, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a single harsh gasp. One moment he had been astride his bay gelding, sitting tall in the saddle, with his wool coat buttoned against the autumn chill, and his silver watch chain gleaming in the dappled light. And the next, he was on his back, with stars dancing at the edges of his vision, and the taste of copper flooding his mouth where he had bitten his tongue. His polished Colt revolver, the one with ivory grips that he had carried through 3 territorial campaigns and never once fired at a living man, skidded away from his outstretched hand, spinning through the carpet of needles until it fetched up against the gnarled root of an ancient pine some yards distant. Above him, silhouetted against the high autumn sky, stood a man who was not a convict, not a prisoner, not a number in a ledger. A man. His chest was bare despite the chill that hung in the mountain air, the copper skin marked with old scars that told stories in a language Harlan had never bothered to learn. Sweat and dirt streaked across his torso in patterns that might have been deliberate, or might simply have been the residue of days spent running, hiding, surviving against odds that would have broken lesser men. A makeshift rope belt fashioned from the remnants of prison shackles, and desperation held up canvas trousers so torn and filthy they might once have been the uniform of a work gang, but were now barely recognizable as clothing at all. The skin around his wrists was darker than the rest of his body raised, and permanent marking where iron had bitten deep for months, or perhaps years. Wicasa. That was his name, though Governor Harlan had never known it. To the governor, he had always been a number in a ledger, a line item in a contract, a piece of property leased from the territorial prison system at $12 per month plus feed and housing. The Lakota warrior held a hunting spear in both hands, a long shaft of ash wood tipped with a steel blade that caught the sunlight and threw it back like a flashed mirror signal. The point hovered over Harlan's chest, with the steadiness of a compass needle pointing true north, held in the grip of a man who knew exactly how much pressure it took to pierce through wool and linen and skin and muscle to reach the heart beneath. Behind Wicasa, a horse stamped and blew nervously, its saddle empty and askew, its reins trailing in the undergrowth like abandoned hope. Farther back, still half hidden in the shadows between 2 massive pines, another Manchask, another ghost from the prison records, another number without a name, held a rifle across his chest, his eyes scanning the forest with the wariness of prey that had learned to think like a predator. "Do it," Chaske said in Lakota, the words harsh and urgent as a crow's warning call. "Kill him now while we have the chance, before the others come." Harlan stared up into Wicasa's face, and for the first time in his carefully managed life, a life built on calculated words and strategic silences, on knowing when to speak and when to let others speak for him, he felt the cold finger of recognition trace its way down his spine like ice water. This was not just any escaped convict. This was something else. Someone else. The eyes looking down at him held no fear, no rage, no emotion at all that Harlan could identify, only the cold calculation of a predator, deciding whether to strike now or wait for a better moment. The ground beneath them trembled. At first, the vibration was so faint that Harlan thought it was merely his own heart hammering against his ribs with the desperation of a trapped animal. But then it grew stronger, more insistent, a rhythmic pulsing that came up through the earth itself, like the pulse of something vast and terrible, waking from ancient sleep. In the distance, beyond the screen of pines and the scattered boulders, a low rumble built toward crescendo. the sound of hooves. Many hooves. Not the measured cadence of cavalry on parade, but something wilder, more chaotic, more fundamentally unstoppable. A stampede. Wicasa had seconds to decide. He could drive the blade down now here in the shadows, where no witness could testify to anything but a governor's tragic death during a dangerous frontier exercise gone wrong. Or he could drag this man, this murderer, this architect of suffering disguised in the respectable clothes of government, out into the light, where justice might be something more than a spear point in the ribs and a body left to rot in the forest. His hands tightened on the shaft of the spear. The blade did not waver, and in that frozen moment, with the dogs howling somewhere in the middle distance, and the earth shaking beneath his feet, and the weight of the past pressing down like a physical burden he could no longer carry alone, every choice Wicasa had ever made, or failed to make, seemed to converge on this single point of sharpened steel hovering above a man's heart. 3 months earlier, before the blood and the running, and the moment when everything broke apart like a dam giving way to flood, that the world had seemed ordered, civilized, under control. Governor Walter Emmett Harlan stood on the wide front porch of his estate house at Silver Pines and surveyed his domain with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed himself to be on the right side of history. The land stretched away from him in every direction. 12,000 acres of virgin timber and rolling pasture rocky draws that cut deep into the mountains, and high meadows where elk grazed in the early morning mist. All of it held together by contracts and deeds and the unshakable conviction that the frontier could be tamed by men of vision and determination. The morning was uncommonly fine. October had come to the high country with a painter's palette of golds and crimsons, and the air held that peculiar crystalline clarity that comes only in autumn when the last of summer's torpid heat has burned away, and winter is still just a distant promise lurking in the high peaks. Harlan breathed deep, filling his lungs with air that smelled of pine resin and wood smoke and the faint metallic tang of approaching weather, and allowed himself a small private smile. "Governor, thanks." Elias Finch materialized at his elbow with the unsettling silence of a man who had made an art of not being noticed until he chose to be. The estate manager was a compact man in his early 40s, with thinning hair slicked back from a high forehead and eyes like chips of flint. He wore a dark vest with a gold watch chain and carried a short riding crop that he tapped against his thigh when particularly pleased. "The arrangements are complete. 6 candidates have been selected from among the most vigorous specimens. Strong runners, all of them. They will provide excellent sport for our distinguished guests." Harlan did not look at him. "You will refrain from using that particular word, Mr. Finch. These are not sporting events. They are training exercises designed to evaluate the efficiency of our security protocols. The distinction is important." "Perfectly clear, Governor." Finch's thin lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "Training exercises, of course." "And the guests. 3 investors from the Union Pacific Railroad Company. Senator Milhouse from the territorial legislature, who has expressed particular interest in our methods. A correspondent from the Territorial Register who desires to write a favorable piece for the Eastern newspapers." Finch paused. "And yourself, of course, should you choose to attend. The men would be greatly honored to have you ride at the head of the column." Pride. That was the hook, and Finch knew it. Harlan felt the small, insistent tug of temptation. He had spent years building his reputation through carefully crafted speeches and meticulously drafted legislation. But there was a part of him, the part that had worn a cavalry officer's uniform in the war that had led men through hostile territory. That part of him wanted this. Wanted to feel the wind in his face and the powerful muscles of a good horse beneath him and the primal thrill of the chase. "I will consider it," he said at last, which meant yes and both men knew it. Far below the main house, in the long, low-ceilinged bunkhouse that served as sleeping quarters for the convict laborers, a man lay awake on a thin straw mattress and stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams. Around him, 60 other men breathed and snored and muttered in their sleep, filling the cramped space with the sounds and smells of too many bodies packed too close together for too long. Wakasa had learned years ago not to let his guard down, even in darkness. Sleep was a dangerous country, where a man could not watch his back or read the subtle signs that meant trouble was approaching. He was 32 years old, though the prison records listed his age as unknown. His body was lean and corded with muscle from years of brutal labor, marked with scars that told stories he had no words for. His hair had been cut short when they brought him to this place, the long braids that had marked him as Lakota shorn away with sheep shears, as if identity itself could be removed with a few careless cuts. They had given him a new name, too, Sam Whitehawk. A name that sounded Indian enough to satisfy the paperwork, but was stripped of any real meaning. In the darkness, with his eyes open and his breathing steady, he let himself remember what he spent his waking hours trying to forget. The winter camp by the Platte River, the lodges arranged in a protective circle against the bitter cold. His father standing in the center, wearing the peace medal that had been given to him by treaty commissioners, a silver disc with the profile of a long-dead president, a symbol of promises made and agreements signed. His father's voice strong and clear, even in the freezing air, calling out to the soldiers in broken English. "We have treaty. We are peaceful people. Do not shoot," the rifles cracking in the cold morning air. One shot, then a dozen, then too many to count. His father falling, the peace medal still around his neck, his hand still raised in a gesture of peace that the soldiers either did not see or did not care to acknowledge. The screams of women and children as the lodges began to burn. The soldiers moving through the camp with torches and bayonets, efficient and methodical. Wakasa had killed a trooper that morning, a young man not much older than himself, his face pale with cold and fear. He had broken a lance shaft and driven the splintered end through the man's throat, had felt the hot spray of arterial blood across his hands. He had wounded 2 others before they beat him unconscious with their rifle butts. When he woke, his hands were chained and his father was dead, and the shield that had hung in the lodge, the sacred shield decorated with blue triangles and yellow sunbursts, was gone. Taken. A trophy. In the darkness of the bunkhouse, Wakasa closed his eyes and felt the old familiar anger stirring. But anger was dangerous here. Anger made a man careless. He breathed deep, let the feeling settle, and opened his eyes again to stare at the ceiling until dawn. 3 miles downhill from Silver Pines, in the frontier town of Bear Creek, Emma Cordelia Pierce stood at the tall window of her one-room schoolhouse and watched the rain trace diagonal lines across the glass. The storm had come in fast from the mountains, turning the single street to churned mud and driving everyone indoors. She was 26 years old, unmarried by choice, and possessed of what the town matrons called, with pursed lips, an unfortunate independent streak. She had been educated at a seminary school back east and had come west with her father after her mother died of fever. The children told her things. Not directly, not in words, but in other ways. In the way they flinched when a door slammed. In the careful way they avoided talking about their fathers who worked at Silver Pines. In the bruises that appeared with disturbing regularity, bruises explained away as accidents, but which Emma's practiced eye recognized as having been made by adult hands wielding instruments of discipline. Her father saw it too. Dr. Andrew Pierce treated injuries from the estate with increasing frequency, broken fingers, infected cuts, knife wounds, always blamed on accidents. He had begun keeping a private ledger recording dates and descriptions, building a catalog of evidence he was too prudent or perhaps too afraid to show anyone. Emma was younger and less patient and increasingly tired of watching children suffer in silence while adults looked away. She turned from the window, gathered her things, and walked to her father's clinic, thinking about a question she had been avoiding. What do you do when the law itself is lawless? When the man who writes the rules is the very one breaking them? She did not have an answer yet, but she was beginning to suspect one was coming. The morning of the hunt dawned clear and cold. In the yard at Silver Pines, 6 men stood in shackles while guards checked rifles and unleashed dogs that strained at their leashes. Wicasa stood with his hands bound, studying the faces of the men who would hunt him. Most were guards. He recognized hard men who did hard work for wages that let them drink away their guilt on Saturday nights. But there were others too. Men in fine coats who sat their horses with easy confidence. The guests, the investors, the senator, the men who would later tell stories about the grand adventure they had undertaken on the wild frontier. Elias Finch addressed the prisoners in a voice that carried across the morning stillness. Gentlemen, you have been selected to participate in a training exercise designed to evaluate our security protocols. The rules are simple and fair. You will be released into the forest. Our personnel will pursue you. If you succeed in evading capture for 6 hours, the governor himself has authorized a review of your sentences with the possibility of early release. If you are apprehended, you return to your work assignments with no penalties. He paused. This is an opportunity to demonstrate your willingness to reform. I suggest you make the most of it. The shackles were removed. The collars were unlocked. For a long moment, the prisoners stood frozen, uncertain whether this was real or some new form of torture. Then the gates slammed open. The dogs were unleashed. A pistol fired into the air. The men ran. They scattered like quail, flushed from cover, each man's terror driving him in a different direction. Wicasa ran with the fluid stride of a man who had once run down wounded buffalo across 20 miles of prairie. He did not run in a straight line. He angled northeast toward the thickest timber where horses would struggle. Behind him, the dogs gave voice, focused, terrible howling. Behind the dogs came the thunder of hooves and the shouts of men. Then a scream that climbed in pitch and ended abruptly. He ran harder. The forest closed around him. Pines grew close together, their lower branches dead and brittle. The ground was carpeted with decades of fallen needles. Somewhere to his left, he heard another man crashing through brush, and then the flat crack of a rifle and a wet, heavy sound. The dogs were much closer now. Wicasa stopped, pressed his back against a pine, and forced himself to breathe slowly, while his mind raced through possibilities. Fighting dogs was suicide. Running from them was only marginally better. But dogs could be tricked. He waited until the baying was almost on top of him, then moved sideways and up, scrambling onto the trunk of a dead pine that had fallen at an angle. He pulled himself into the tangle of dead branches and pressed himself flat. 3 dogs burst into view, lean and scarred and trained to kill. They milled around the base of the tree in confusion, barking and whining as the scent vanished. A rider appeared, a guard named Carlson, whom Wicasa knew by reputation as a man who enjoyed hurting people. Carlson cursed, looking around. "Where'd the red bastard go?" The dogs had no answer. Carlson kicked his horse forward, studying the ground. Probably doubled back. "Come on, you useless curs." He rode on. The dogs followed. Wicasa stayed in the tree for another 5 full minutes, counting seconds before climbing down and beginning to run again. Not away from the hunt, but through it, circling back toward places where hunters would not expect him. By late afternoon, Wicasa had reached the river, marking the eastern boundary of Silver Pines. He crouched behind a boulder and studied the far bank with patient attention. The river ran fast and cold, swollen with snowmelt white water churning over rocks. The only fordable crossing was directly ahead, a shallow stretch where the water would come no higher than a man's waist. It was guarded. 3 men sat their horses on the far bank, rifles across their saddles, waiting. One was Grizzly Joe Magnus, a bounty hunter perhaps 50 years old, grizzled and weathered with a tobacco-stained beard, and eyes that held the weariness of a man who had done things he could not undo. "I see you hiding there," Joe called out across the water, his voice flat. "No point in playing possum. Come on out and let's do this the easy way." Wicasa did not move. He was not the only fugitive who had made it this far. Somewhere to his left, he could hear labored breathing. "You boys got 5 minutes." Joe continued spitting tobacco juice into the river. "After that, we start shooting whether we can see you or not." A voice came from the rocks, rough and desperate. "This ain't right, Joe. You know this ain't no training exercise, this is murder." Joe shifted in his saddle. "Don't make a lick of difference what's right. Law's the law, and the law says you're property till your sentence is done. Now quit jawing and get out here." Wicasa recognized the voice. Nicodemus, a black man, perhaps 10 years older, a former Union scout convicted of horse theft on one white rancher's word. They had become something like friends at Silver Pines, watching each other's backs, sharing food when rations ran short. Now Nicodemus was trapped with what sounded like a bullet wound, and both options, surrender or resistance, led to the same place. Wicasa was gathering himself to move when he heard something that changed everything. And the rattle of wheels and the hard breathing of horses being pushed beyond their pace. Emma Pierce had been visiting the Morrison farm north of town, checking on a girl with fever. The fever had broken, and Emma was riding back in the borrowed farm wagon when she heard gunshots. 1 shot she might have dismissed. 2 shots, perhaps. But then came a fusillade rolling thunder that sent birds exploding from trees in panicked clouds. And then, distantly, a scream. She knew something terrible was happening. And she knew that if she turned around and went home and pretended she had heard nothing, she would never be able to look at herself in a mirror again. So she slapped the reins hard and drove toward the sound of gunfire. She came around a bend and saw it all, the 3 mounted men blocking the ford, the trapped fugitives, a body floating in the shallows, with blood spreading around it. She saw a tall Indian man behind a boulder poised to throw himself into the current. She saw another man in the rocks, clutching his bleeding side. And she saw Grizzly Joe raising his rifle. "Stop!" The word tore from her throat, loud and harsh, and filled with authority she did not know she possessed. "Stop this instant!" The 3 riders turned. Joe stared at her as if she had sprouted wings. "Miss Pierce, what in the hell are you doing here? What does it look like I'm stopping you from murdering a man in cold blood?" "This ain't murder. This is law enforcement. These men are escaped prisoners. These men are being hunted like animals for sport." She drove the wagon toward the river's edge. "And if you think I don't know exactly what goes on at Silver Pines, you're a fool, Mr. Magnus. My father has been treating injuries from that place for 2 years. Injuries no legitimate prison could produce." Joe's face darkened. "You need to turn that wagon around and go home, miss. This ain't your concern." "I'll determine what is my concern, thank you very much." She turned toward the rocks. "You there, can you walk?" A pause. "Not well, ma'am, but I can try." "Then get in this wagon, now." A young deputy kicked his horse forward. "You're harboring fugitives, Miss Pierce. That's a crime. You could hang." Emma looked at him with a gaze so cold the young man flinched. "Then you'll have to shoot these men in front of me first. And I rather think that will make for an uncomfortable story in the newspapers." "Don't you?" For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Wicasa exploded from cover, sprinting for the wagon with astonishing speed. He was in the water before Joe could react, plowing through the current. A rifle cracked the bullet, whipping past his ear. He did not slow. He grabbed the wagon and hauled himself up. Nicodemus was already moving, half crawling from the rocks. Wicasa reached down and pulled him up with desperate strength. Nicodemus cried out as the movement tore at his wound, but he was in. "Go!" Wicasa shouted. "Go now!" Emma did not hesitate. She brought the whip down, and the horses lunged forward, the wagon lurching and swaying as it gathered speed. Behind them, Joe raised his rifle. His finger tightened on the trigger. The sights lined up on Emma's back. It would be an easy shot. But something, guilt, exhaustion, and the memory of 100 other men he had tracked for money that bought no comfort, made him hesitate. And in that moment, the wagon was gone, leaving only dust and fading hoofbeats. Joe lowered the rifle slowly. He spat tobacco juice into the dirt and said to no one in particular, "Hell." Emma Pierce's root cellar was not designed to hide fugitives. It was barely adequate for storing potatoes. The space was perhaps 8 feet square, and so low a grown man could not stand upright. The walls were packed earth-cold and damp and smelling of clay. The only light came from candles brought down the narrow ladder. Wicasa lay on his back on the dirt floor, his shoulders pressed against the cold walls. Next to him, close enough that their bodies touched, because there was no room to lie. Otherwise, Nicodemus sprawled with one hand, pressed to his wounded side. It was dark. Not the relative darkness of night, but the absolute suffocating darkness of being buried alive. The air was thick and heavy, hard to breathe, tasting of soil and blood and fear. Above them, boots thumped across the clinic floor with heavy, deliberate tread. Men's voices demanded to know if Dr. Pierce had treated anyone with gunshot wounds. Emma's voice, steady and cold, informed them that doctor-patient confidentiality was sacred, and that she would see them in hell before she answered questions from men who hunted human beings for sport. More boots, more voices. The scrape of furniture being moved drawers opened the sounds of a thorough search. Then footsteps walking directly over where they lay hidden. Dirt sifted down onto Wicasa's open eyes. He did not blink, did not move. Became stone, became earth, became nothing but the space between heartbeats. Nicodemus's hand found his in the darkness and squeezed once hard. "Hold on. Stay quiet. Survive this." Wicasa squeezed back. The boots moved on. The voices faded. A door slammed. But still they did not move, because the first rule of staying hidden was never to relax too soon. It was a full hour before Emma opened the trapdoor and let lamplight spill down. She looked pale and drawn, but her voice was steady. "They're gone. For now." Over the following days, a routine developed. Dr. Pierce stitched Nicodemus's wound with horsehair thread and liberal whiskey, muttering about damned fools who thought they could outrun bullets. Emma brought food in small, careful amounts. And in the hours between patrols, Emma and Wicasa sat side by side in that narrow cellar and began building trust. She taught him to read and write. Not the crude literacy of prison orders, but real reading that opened doors to ideas and arguments and the architecture of law. She traced letters on scraps of paper with a carpenter's nail dipped in ash while he watched and repeated the sounds. "Why are you doing this?" he asked one night. Emma paused. "Because what they're doing is wrong." "Many things are wrong. Most people do nothing." "Then I suppose I'm not most people." She looked at him in the candlelight. "Tell me about your father." It was the first time anyone had asked. In all the years since the raid through all the prisons and stockades, no one had ever once asked Wicasa about his father as a person. So he told her. Gradually, over many nights in halting English that grew smoother with practice. He told her about the winter camp by the Platte River, about his father who had been chief, who had believed peace was possible, who had worn the treaty medal with pride. He was good man, Wicasa said quietly. Strong, wise. He'd tell young warriors courage is knowing when not to fight. He'd try to make peace. He'd call out to soldiers, tell them we have treaty, we are not enemy. They shoot him anyway. And then they take his shield, take his medal, make him trophy like deer head they hang on wall. Emma's hand found his in the darkness, not a romantic gesture, but something deeper, a touch that acknowledged pain too large for words. We'll make them answer for it, she said fiercely. All of it. How I am escaped prisoner. You are woman. We have no power. We have truth. And we have law if we can make it work the way it's supposed to. She squeezed his hand. My father says there's a federal circuit judge coming through Bear Creek in 3 weeks. Federal courts can overrule territorial governors. If we can get evidence to that judge, real evidence, we might have a chance. What evidence? There's a ledger. Mr. Finch keeps records of everything prisoners released, amounts wagered, names of participants. If we can get that ledger, we can prove what they're doing. Where is it kept? In Finch's office at Silver Pines, in a locked desk inside a guarded building. She smiled without humor. I didn't say it would be easy. Martin Klaus had come to America with dreams of prosperity. He was 19, German, working at the Silver Pines sawmill and sending money home to his mother and sister in Bremen. On the afternoon, when everything changed, he was hauling lumber past the main office when he heard guards talking on the porch, laughing, counting money, discussing wagers. I got $10 on that tall Lakota buck. He's got more sand than the others. Might last a whole hour this time. I'm putting 15 on the old colored scout. Clever beats strong every time. Colored and clever don't mix in my experience. More laughter. The clink of coins. When's the next run? 2 weeks. Governor's coming out personal this time. Martin kept walking, his stomach churning. He had known in an abstract way that the training exercises were not what they were supposed to be. Everyone knew. It was one of those open secrets people did not talk about. That night, Martin sat in his cramped room and tried to write home. He managed 3 lines about the weather before his hand started shaking. He thought about his sister in her schoolroom, his mother in her factory, how they believed in him. What would they think if they knew what he was part of? 2 days later, unable to bear his conscience, he found Emma Pierce standing alone in the schoolyard after dark. Miss Pierce? His English was heavily accented. I must speak with you. I have information about Silver Pines. He glanced around nervously. I stack lumber near the office. There's a side window. The latchet is broken. Nobody has fixed it. Emma studied him, weighing risk against necessity. Then she nodded once. When it rains, she said quietly, be ready. The storm came 3 nights later, rolling down from the peaks, with thunder and lightning and rain that came down in sheets. It was perfect. Emma, Wicasa, and Martin moved through the darkness, like ghosts staying low using buildings for cover timing movements to thunderclaps. Rain hammered down, soaking through clothes, turning ground to mud. Martin led them to the side window of Finch's office and boosted Emma up. She wriggled through, dropped inside. Wicasa followed his larger frame, making passage difficult. Martin came last. Inside the office was dark and smelled of tobacco and ink. Emma shielded her lantern while Wicasa moved to the desk. The lock was good, but not impossible. He had learned a few things in prison, including how to pick locks with a bent nail and patience. The desk opened with a soft click. The ledger was there, a large book bound in brown leather pages, covered in neat columns of names and dates and numbers. Emma held the lantern close and began to read, her lips moving silently. October 14th, 1867. Released 6 convicts for training exercise. Returned 0. Recorded as lawful suppression of escape attempt. Wagers collected $200. November 3rd, 1867. Guest demonstration. 2 confirmed kills. Senator Milhouse requests bonus compensation. Authorized $50. December 12, 1867. Convict Nuzra 47, White Hawk. Governor W.E. Harlan, $50 at 3-1 odds. Her hands trembled. "This is enough," she breathed. "This is more than enough." But Wicasa was not looking at the ledger. His attention had been caught by something else, a narrow door at the back of the office, half hidden behind a filing cabinet. Something drew him toward it. He pushed the door open and stepped into a trophy room. The space was small, windowless, lined with shelves. Rifles gleamed. Cavalry sabers hung crossed. Framed maps showed military campaigns. Mounted animal heads stared down with glass eyes. But it was the far wall that made Wicasa stop, as if he had walked into an invisible wall. A shield hung there. Round, perhaps 2 feet across, made of buffalo hide stretched over wood. The leather was weather-stained and cracked, but the beadwork was still visible, a pattern of blue triangles alternating with yellow sunbursts. Next to the shield, a tarnished silver piece medal hung from a leather thong. Wicasa's vision narrowed to a tunnel. The world contracted until there was nothing but that shield and those beads and the pattern he had known since before he could walk. He crossed the room without conscious thought, his hand trembling as he reached out. Then his fingers made contact, and the past crashed over him with the force of an avalanche. His father's lodge warm with fire. His father sitting cross-legged, the shield across his knees, explaining to a boy of 8. "These triangles, they are the mountains where our people sheltered. These sunbursts, they are hope with each new dawn. This shield protected your grandfather and his father before him beyond memory. It is not just leather and wood and beads. It is the story of who we are." The winter morning, his father standing with this shield and the medal calling out, "We have treaty, we are peaceful, do not shoot." The rifles cracking, his father falling. A trooper tearing the shield free, holding it overhead, and whooping Wicasa's knees buckled. He caught himself against the wall, one hand still pressed flat against the shield, and a sound escaped from deep in his chest. Not quite a sob, not quite a howl, something raw and broken that had been locked inside for years. Emma was beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "Wicasa, what is it?" He could not speak. He pointed at the shield, then at a photograph on the wall. The photograph showed a younger man in cavalry uniform boot resting on a dead buffalo rifle across his shoulders. Beneath it, a brass plate, Major Walter E. Harlan, 3rd Cavalry Platte Campaign, 1862. Emma drew in a sharp breath. That's the same year. Same year, same place, same man. Wicasa's voice was barely recognizable. "He kill my father. He take his shield like trophy. Keep it on wall to look at and remember. And now he do same thing to us. Hunt us. This is not accident. This is who he is. He hunt my people then. He hunt us now. Same man, same evil." The weight of understanding settled over them. This was not just corruption or casual brutality. This was something deeper, a man who had built an entire life around the belief that some human beings were simply prey. "We take the ledger," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the horror. "We make sure the world knows exactly what he is. I want to kill him." The words came out flat, emotionless. "I want to drive this spear through his heart and watch him die." "I know," Emma said gently. "But if you kill him in secret, He becomes a martyr, a victim of savage violence. His death proves everything he said about your people. She met his gaze. But if we drag him into a courtroom, if we make him answer in front of judges and newspapermen, he becomes what he truly is, a murderer who used his position to indulge his taste for killing. That's the victory that lasts. Wicasa stared at her. Some part of him, the warrior, the part that understood blood debt and vengeance, wanted to reject this. But another part, the part that had learned to survive by understanding their systems and laws, knew she was right. The door to the outer office slammed open. Boots thundered across the floor. "Move," Martin hissed. Emma stuffed the ledger inside her coat. Wicasa grabbed the shield from the wall. He could not leave, it could not abandon his father's memory, and followed her toward the window. Finch's guards burst through just as Wicasa went through the window, head first, shield clutched to his chest, rain hammering his face. He hit mud and rolled, came up running, behind shouts and gunfire. Ahead, darkness and storm and the fragile hope of survival. They ran. By morning, new wanted posters covered every building in Bear Creek. The sketch was more detailed. The text, stark, Samuel Whitehawk, ringleader of prison mutiny. Armed and dangerous, 100 reward shoot, on sight if necessary. Governor Harlan stood in Finch's office and stared at the empty desk. "This is insurrection," he said quietly. "An attack on lawful authority. I want them found. I want them arrested. And I want it done quickly." "The school teacher is involved," Finch said. "Her father has been treating injuries without filing reports. They're harboring fugitives." "Then arrest them both. Make an example. Let everyone understand there are consequences for interfering with justice." But arresting Emma Pierce required evidence, and the problem with intimidation as a strategy was that it worked right up until people stopped being afraid. Harlan needed to reassert control, needed a victory so decisive it would silence questions. "Mr. Finch," he said slowly, "I believe it's time for another demonstration." 3 days later, Dr. Pierce sat his daughter and Nicodemus down and explained the situation. "The federal circuit judge is due in Bear Creek in 2 weeks. That is the only authority who can bring charges against a territorial governor. If we go to the local sheriff, we'll be arrested. If we run, we lose our chance." He looked at them both. "We have to wait and keep our heads down." Nicodemus shook his head. 2 weeks is too long, Doc. Harlan's going to move against us. We can feel it coming. He'll either recover the ledger or make sure we're all dead before we can testify." "Then what do you suggest?" "Don't wait for the judge to come to us. We go to him." Nicodemus leaned forward despite the pain. "Judge is making his circuit. He'll be in Clayton City in 4 days. Hard 2-day ride from here, but doable. Martin knows the back trails. I can navigate by stars. We intercept the judge early, warn him what's waiting, give him time to prepare." Dr. Pierce did not like it. "If you're caught." "We won't be," Nicodemus said with more confidence than he felt. That night, he and Martin slipped out of Bear Creek on horseback, carrying wrapped copies of the ledger's most damning pages and a letter from Dr. Pierce. They never reached Clayton City. The ambush came in a narrow canyon where the trail squeezed between sheer rock walls with nowhere to run. 6 men with rifles positioned on high ground, waiting. The first volley hit Martin's horse. The animal screamed and went down, throwing Martin hard. He scrambled for cover, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Through shock and pain, he saw Nicodemus trying to control his rearing horse. The second volley tore Nicodemus from the saddle. He hit the ground and did not move. Martin tried to reach him. A round clipped his shoulder, spinning him around, and he fell backward into a crevice between boulders. He wedged himself deep and pressed flat, while bullets chipped rock and the air filled with dust and smoke. When the shooting stopped, he heard hoofbeats, heard men dismounting their boots crunching on gravel, heard voices discussing where to throw the body. He stayed in the crevice for 6 hours, not moving until full dark. Then he crawled out and searched the canyon floor. He found Nicodemus's hat soaked with blood, but no body. They had thrown him into one of the deep ravines. Martin stood at the edge and looked down into darkness, and knew Nicodemus was beyond help. He turned and began the long walk back to Bear Creek, carrying nothing but his wounds and his grief, and the knowledge that trying to do right could get you killed. When Martin stumbled into Dr. Pierce's clinic 3 days later, half dead from blood loss and infection, Emma took one look at his face and knew. Nicodemus. Martin shook his head, could not speak. Emma closed her eyes, took a breath, opened them. "All right," she said quietly. She found Wicasa that night at the edge of town, where he had been hiding in a thicket of cottonwoods. When he saw her face, he knew. "They kill him," he said. Not a question. "Yes." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like distant water. "This governor," Wicasa said at last, his voice very quiet and controlled. "He killed my father because we ask for peace. Now he killed my friend because we ask for justice. This is who he is." He looked at Emma. "You want to use law against him? I understand. But when law does not work, what then?" "Then we make it work," Emma said fiercely. "We make them see. We drag it all into the light where they can't ignore it." "How?" "I don't know yet. But I will think of something." She was still thinking 3 days later when word came that Governor Harlan himself was organizing another training demonstration at Copper Canyon, and that the federal judge newly arrived in Bear Creek was invited to attend as a guest of honor. The demonstration was scheduled for a crisp morning in late October when the aspens were turning gold. A platform had been erected on the rim of Copper Canyon with canvas awnings chairs for dignitaries and a clear view of the canyon floor. Federal Circuit Judge Amos Blackburn sat in the center, a lean man in his 50s, with graying hair and eyes that missed little. He had been on the frontier long enough to know that training demonstrations were often euphemisms, but he had learned that sometimes the only way to catch corruption was to let it perform. Beside him sat Governor Harlan, impeccably dressed, smiling and gracious, as he explained the careful protocols Silver Pines used. "What you will see today, Judge Blackburn, is a model of modern penology in action. A controlled exercise demonstrating how quickly and humanely we respond to escape attempts. I believe you will find it most impressive." Judge Blackburn said nothing. He simply nodded and watched. Below in the canyon, 6 prisoners were marched out in chains. Wicasa was among them. So was Martin Klaus, who had been recaptured the day before and whose wounded shoulder had been hastily bandaged. Elias Finch addressed them from horseback. "Gentlemen, you will be released as part of a training exercise. You will attempt to evade capture. Our personnel will demonstrate proper apprehension techniques. This is an educational opportunity. Cooperate and you will not be harmed." The chains were removed. A pistol fired. The prisoners ran. Wicasa did not run aimlessly this time. He knew exactly where he was going. 2 nights earlier, Grizzly Joe Magnus had come to him alone, unarmed. "I can't make this right." Joe had said, his voice rough as gravel. "Can't undo what I done, but maybe I can keep it from happening again." He pressed a crude map into Wicasa's hands. North Ridge, big fallen log, horse and spear behind it, and something else longhorns penned in the side draw. Gates weak, if something were to spook them during the chaos. He met Wikasa's eyes. "I ain't asking for forgiveness. Just finish this." Now, as the hunt unfolded, Wikasa ran for the North Ridge with Martin at his side. Behind them, riders whooped and spurred horses forward. Dogs bayed, rifles cracked. Wikasa found the log, found the horse, found the spear. The weapon felt right in his hands. He vaulted onto the horse's back and wheeled around, no longer running but hunting, circling back toward where Governor Harlan rode at the head of the column. The moment when Wikasa stepped onto the trail directly in front of Harlan's horse would be described in a dozen different ways later. Some said he appeared like a ghost. Others said he moved so fast no one saw him coming. Wikasa struck the nearest guard's horse with the spear butt, sending the animal rearing. The guard fell. Wikasa spun and drove the shaft into Finch's ribs, knocking him from the saddle. Then he turned to Harlan. The governor's colt skittered away through pine needles. Harlan looked up stunned at the man standing over him with a spear raised. "Do you remember?" Wikasa asked quietly. "A winter camp by the Platte River. A man wearing a peace medal, a shield with blue triangles." Recognition and fear showed in Harlan's eyes. Wikasa could have killed him. Should have. Every instinct screamed for blood. Instead, he slammed the spear through the fabric of Harlan's coat into the dirt, pinning the governor without piercing flesh. "You die standing in front of them," Wikasa said. "Not hidden in forest like coward. You face what you did." He hauled Harlan to his feet, bound his wrists with rope, and began dragging him towards open ground where the assembled dignitaries could see. On the far side of the canyon, Grizzly Joe Magnus completed his part. Over 2 nights, he had quietly moved a restless herd of longhorn cattle into a side draw held back by a weak gate. The cattle were nervous, spooked by gunfire and the smell of blood. Now Joe cut the rope, holding the gate, and fired his pistol into the air, yelling. The cattle exploded forward, smashing through the gate in an eruption of splintered wood and dust. A stampede of longhorns is not picturesque. It is pure, mindless, unstoppable violence, tons of muscle and horn, moving at terrifying speed, destroying everything with the efficiency of an avalanche. The herd hit the canyon floor like a tidal wave. Horses screamed and scattered. Riders who did not move fast enough simply vanished beneath hooves. Dogs disappeared without a trace. The ground shook, and dust so thick it turned the sun orange filled the air. From the platform, Judge Blackburn stood and gripped the railing, his face white. "What in the name of—" "Stampede," someone shouted. "Get back from the edge." Part of the herd veered toward a narrow defile, where Emma Pierce had climbed down with bolt cutters, trying to free prisoners. A jammed wooden chute blocked the only path to higher ground, trapping them. The cattle were 50 yards away and closing. Joe ran for the blockage, his old legs pumping. He reached the jammed beam and began hacking at it with his knife. "Move, damn you, move. 40 yards, 30. Emma pulled at the beam. Martin joined her with his good arm. The wood groaned, but did not give. 20 yards. Joe planted his boot and kicked with everything he had. The beam cracked, shifted, came free with a shriek. The gate swung open, revealing a narrow gap. "Go!" Joe shoved Emma toward the opening. "Go now." She did not argue. She grabbed Martin and pulled him through. Other prisoners squeezed through one by one. Wikasa appeared from the dust, dragging Harlan, and shoved the governor through the gap. Emma hauled Martin. They squeezed through scraping shoulders on rock. The longhorns poured past in a roaring river of horn and hide and dust, missing the gap by mere feet, so close Emma felt the heat of their bodies. Joe turned to follow. A steer caught him from behind, tossing him into the rocks. He hit hard, his head cracking against stone. The herd surged over the spot where he fell, and when the dust settled, only a crushed hat and a dark smear remained. Wikasa looked back at where Joe had fallen. He raised one hand in a brief salute, a warrior's acknowledgement to a fallen comrade who had chosen at the end to stand on the right side. Joe had opened the gate. Dust hung in the air like a shroud. The canyon was wreckage, scattered cattle, injured horses, dazed riders. On the platform, Judge Blackburn stood at the railing with white knuckles and grim face. Wakasa dragged Harlan onto a rocky shelf visible from both canyon floor and platform. Emma climbed beside him, her dress-torn hair wild, the ledger clutched against her chest. Martin braced himself against a boulder. Chaske covered remaining guards with a rifle. "What?" Judge Blackburn said, his voice cutting through chaos like a blade. "Is the meaning of this?" Emma held up the ledger. "This is a record of murder conducted under color of law." And she began to read. She read dates and names and amounts wagered. She read entries detailing men released who never came back. She read notations about guests and kills confirmed, and bonus payments. She read Governor Harlan's own name, written in his own hand next to wagers on specific prisoners. Her voice did not waver, did not break, did not give them room to dismiss her as hysterical. When she finished, Dr. Pierce climbed onto the platform and placed a small leather pouch in Judge Blackburn's hands. Inside was the peace medal and sworn statements from Lakota elders who remembered the winter raid of 1862. Judge Blackburn examined the medal, looked at the photograph Dr. Pierce brought, looked down at Harlan standing in chains on the canyon floor. "Governor Harlan," the judge said slowly, "is this medal yours?" Harlan opened his mouth, closed it. No words came. Judge Blackburn turned to Wakasa. "Who are you?" Wakasa stood straighter. "My name is Wakasa, son of the chief who was killed by Major Harlan in winter of 1862 at Platte River. That medal belonged to my father. That shield hang in my father's lodge. Major Harlan take it when he killed my father. Now Governor Harlan hunt men for sport and call it justice. Same man, same crime, different people." The silence was absolute. Judge Blackburn turned to Finch, who stood with his hat in his hands. "Mr. Finch, is there a ledger at Silver Pines documenting these activities?" Finch glanced at Harlan, glanced at the crowd, saw no escape. "Yes, Your Honor." "And who organized these hunts?" A pause, then quietly, "The governor, Your Honor. Always the governor's idea." Harlan's head snapped up. "That is a damned lie. I gave no such orders. This man has exceeded his authority." "Silence." Judge Blackburn's voice cracked like a whip. "You will have opportunity to present your defense in court. Until then, you will remain silent." He gestured to the U.S. Marshals who accompanied him. "Arrest Governor Walter Harlan and Elias Finch on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of office fraud, and violations of federal statutes governing the treatment of prisoners and labor contracts. They are to be held without bail pending trial in federal court." The marshals descended. The deputies who had been Harlan's men stepped aside, unwilling to meet his eyes. The marshals stripped Harlan of his sash, took his watch and ring, and locked manacles around his wrists. For a man who had built his identity on power and respectability, being arrested before newspapermen and investors was destruction more complete than any bullet. Finch tried to run, made it perhaps 10 yards before a marshal tackled him. As Harlan was led away, stumbling in his torn coat with chains on his wrists, Judge Blackburn called out once more. "Miss Pierce, please remain in Bear Creek. Your testimony will be required." Emma nodded, too exhausted to speak. Judge Blackburn looked at Wakasa. "And you, sir, I will see that your father's belongings are returned and that your own case is reviewed by federal authorities. What was done to you and your people was unconscionable. I cannot undo it. But I can ensure it is acknowledged." Wakasa said nothing. just held the shield against his chest and tried to remember how to breathe. The trial began 4 months later in a federal courthouse in Denver. The courtroom was packed. Emma Pierce took the stand and in clear, measured tones described everything. She presented the ledger. She explained how she obtained it. She did not apologize and did not flinch under cross-examination. Martin Klaus testified about the ambush that killed Nicodemus, his voice breaking only once. Dr. Pierce testified about injuries he had treated and questions he had been afraid to ask. Wicasa testified, last speaking through an interpreter at first, and then in his own halting English. He told the court about the winter raid, about his father's murder, about the shield and the peace medal. He told them about Silver Pines and the hunts and what it felt like to be treated as less than human by men who called themselves civilized. The prosecutor was a sharp-faced man named Caldwell, who had built his career prosecuting frontier corruption. He had 3 days to present the government's case, and he used them methodically, building a structure of evidence so solid that by the time he finished, even Harlan's lawyers looked defeated. On the 4th day, Harlan took the stand in his own defense. He was compelling. Articulate, educated, capable of making complicated arguments sound reasonable. He spoke of the challenges of governing a frontier territory, of the need for strong measures to protect civilized society. He admitted that perhaps his subordinates had exceeded their authority, but insisted he had never personally authorized the hunts. "I am not a perfect man," he said, looking at the jury. "I have made mistakes. But everything I have done in service of law and order. If my trust was misplaced, if men I employed committed crimes in my name, then I am guilty only of poor judgment, not of murder." It was a good speech. If the jury had voted, then some might have acquitted him. But then Caldwell stood for cross-examination. "Governor Harlan," he said mildly, "you testified that you never personally authorized these hunts." "That is correct. Yet we have your signature in the ledger, your handwriting, your name, placing wagers on specific prisoners. Those entries are forgeries. Finch could easily have copied my hand." "I see." Caldwell walked to the evidence table and picked up the peace medal. "Can you tell the court about this medal?" Harlan hesitated. "It is a peace medal given to Indian chiefs during treaty negotiations. It was found among the effects at Silver Pines. More specifically, it was found in your trophy room, along with a Lakota shield marked with clan symbols, along with a photograph of you as Major Walter Harlan of the 3rd Cavalry, along with campaign maps from the Platte River region dated 1862. Caldwell let each fact land like a stone. "Do you deny that you commanded troops during the raid that killed Wicasa's father?" "I deny nothing. I was a cavalry officer. I followed orders. We were engaged in lawful military operations against hostile forces." "Hostile forces?" Caldwell's voice sharpened. "Is that what you called women and children huddled in winter lodges?" "I called them casualties of war, regrettable but inevitable." "And the trophies you took, the medal torn from a dead man's neck, the shield displayed on your wall, were those also inevitable?" Harlan's composure cracked. "I took nothing. If items were collected by soldiers under my command, that was their prerogative. I was a young officer following orders." "You were a killer," Caldwell said flatly. "Then and now. The only thing that changed was the justification you invented. You called it military necessity during the war. You called it convict management after. But the truth is simpler. You are a man who enjoys killing, who believes himself superior to those he kills, and who has spent his life finding legal excuses to indulge that pleasure." He turned to the jury. "Gentlemen, Governor Harlan asks you to believe he is a victim of overzealous subordinates. I ask you to look at the evidence. Look at the ledger. Look at the trophy room. Look at the pattern of behavior stretching back decades. And then ask yourselves, is this a man who was deceived? Or is this a man who built an empire on the suffering of those he considered less than human? The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict without hesitation, guilty on all counts. Judge Blackburn sentenced Harlan to life imprisonment in a federal penitentiary with the possibility of execution pending appeal. Finch received the same. Several other officials were subsequently charged and convicted. As Harlan was led from the courtroom in chains, he looked once at Wicasa. Their eyes met. And in that moment, all the careful rhetoric fell away, and there was only naked hatred and the hatred of a man who believed he should never have been held accountable. Wicasa looked back without expression. He had nothing to say, except perhaps this, "I survived you. Your name will be remembered as a byword for cruelty. Mine will be forgotten, but I survived you, and that is enough." 6 months after the trial, on a spring morning, when the grass along Bear Creek was green and thick, and the cottonwoods were just beginning to leaf out, Emma Pierce and Wicasa stood together on the land the federal court had restored to the Lakota. It was not much. 400 acres of riverbank and forest, a fraction of what had been taken. But it was land that could not be stolen again without due process. Already a small settlement was taking shape, a handful of log cabins built by men who had once been prisoners, a school shed where Emma taught children to read in both English and Lakota, gardens scratched into the rich bottomland, the beginning tentative, fragile, but real, of something like community. Dr. Pierce maintained his clinic in town, but rode out twice a week to treat anyone who needed him. Martin Klaus had taken work at an honest sawmill and was teaching carpentry skills to young men. The women from town had begun to visit, bringing food and supplies, gradually learning to see the settlement not as a threat, but as neighbors. Wicasa knew it would not last forever. Sooner or later, someone would find a legal excuse to take the land back, or a railroad would need to come through. The frontier was not kind to small victories. But for now, in this moment, it was enough. He stood on a small rise overlooking the river and watched the sun climb above the mountains. Beside him, Emma stood with her arms folded, her hair pulled back in a simple braid. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. Wicasa did not answer right away. He looked out at the settlement, at the children playing near the water, at the smoke rising from cooking fires, at all the small signs of life continuing despite everything. "I will stay," he said at last. "We'll teach young ones the old ways so they do not forget. We'll hunt, we'll work the land, we'll help build this place into something strong." He glanced at her. "And you? Same thing, I suppose. Teach, build, try to make this little corner of the world better than the rest of it." She smiled slightly. "We make a strange pair." "Yes, but we are alive. We are free. That is not small thing." "No," Emma agreed. "That is not a small thing at all." They stood in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher and the day warmed. Later, they would ride the boundaries together, planning where new houses might go, where a proper schoolhouse could be built. Later, there would be work and worry, and all the difficulties of building something from nothing. But for now, in this moment of stillness, they simply stood together and watched the light spread across the valley. Wicasa reached out and took Emma's hand. She squeezed back. And they stood that way, fingers intertwined, as the world turned toward spring, and the river ran clear and cold over ancient stones. And somewhere in the settlement below, a child laughed with pure, unself-conscious joy, the sound of someone who had never been hunted and never would be, not if they had anything to say about it. Justice had come slowly, imperfectly, too late for many. But it had come. In the distance, the mountains rose dark against the morning sky, ancient and unchanging. The river murmured its eternal song. A dog barked in the settlement, happy and unafraid. Children called to each other in a mixture of English and Lakota, their voices carrying on the wind. The man who had once been hunted for sport now guarded his own piece of earth. He was not alone. Beside him stood a woman who had chosen to stand between him and the guns, to risk everything for a truth she believed in. The ledger that had once condemned him had become the record that saved him. And the land beneath their feet was no longer a governor's playground, but the fragile, hard-won beginning of a shared home. The past could not be undone. The scars would not fully heal. The dead would not return. But the future, uncertain, difficult, and precious, was theirs to shape. And that, in the end, was enough. Wicasa looked at Emma. She looked back. And in that moment, without words, they understood that what they were building together was more than survival. It was something worth defending, something worth believing in, something that might, with enough care and courage and stubbornness, endure. The stars had faded with the dawn, but they would return when night came. And they would still be there in the sky, above this valley, bearing witness to the small, human dramas unfolding below, dramas of loss and courage, of cruelty and redemption, of endings and beginnings. And as the sun climbed higher and the settlement came fully awake, with the sounds of morning axes biting wood hammers, driving nails, voices raised in greeting and laughter, and the thousand small exchanges that make up a community, Wicasa and Emma turned together and walked down the hill toward the work that waited hand in hand. Two people who had survived the darkness and chosen to build something in the light that remained.